There's a narrative in Pakistan that Pakistan could default without international help if many other the friendly country do not help us, then we may default. There is a narrative. Do you think? And the people are comparing us with Sri Lanka. Do you think the comparison of Pakistan with Sri Lanka is fair, or if Pakistan, with a population of 225 million, if default, then what could the fallout on the world, on the other economies?
I'm afraid to say I don't think so. I suppose you're thinking of a too big to fail argument. Is that the idea? I mean, there are countries with also populations over 200 million and larger economies, Indonesia, Brazil, who have had Nigeria, who have had debt crises. In some cases under pressure now, but I'm particularly thinking of the 80s and the 90s. And their large populations didn't make them too large to fail.
Hello, viewers. Today, I have a very special guest from Howard University, and we will discuss a number of things with him. We will discuss the global scenario at the moment, what is going to happen in the economy of the world, and then the exchange rate and the currency crisis and the digital currencies and many other things. And the guest is Professor Jeffrey Frankel from Howard University. The student of economics and the professor of economics and the researcher in the field of economics. The Professor Jeffrey is the professor of capital formation and growth, and he is a research associate with at the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, and he served at the Council of Economic Advisor in 96 to 99 with the Bill Clinton government. His books on exchange rate and currencies are very well known to the students of the international finance and the international economics. And his other area of research interest are of course, the currencies, the commodities, the financial crisis, the fiscal policy, the monetary policy, the regional trade blocks, and many other things. So we have a pleasure to have him with us. And sir, welcome to our show.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that nice introduction.
Sir, let's start. So nowadays, you know that the economy of Pakistan is really struggling, and when the economic manager of Pakistan, they have a very standard line that the global scenario is very difficult, and the global scenario which they refer is that globally the inflation is very high, globally the Ukraine-Russia war is added into the energy crisis, and then some other things are there. So I just eager to know that what is going to happen globally. Will it be the stagflation, inflation, or recession, or depression, or something else? What do you see, sir?
In the United States and globally, there's all this talk about how we're headed for recession or in recession, and as you say, a combination of recession and inflation, which inflation has certainly been unexpectedly high for the last year or two. Reminiscent of the 1970s and the 1980s. I think it's premature, certainly in the case of the United States, to say that we're in recession or stagflation. There's greater problems in some other countries. Europe, the European continent, will be severely affected by energy if it gets loses its imports of oil and natural gas from Russia. So recession in the European Union is likely. China is troubled still by COVID-19, and especially the reaction to it, to go for a zero COVID policy with a lot of shutdowns. So China has certainly lost its growth, and growth rate falling possibly even below zero. And the rest of the world is adversely affected by these circumstances. In response to this inflation, of course, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates, and other central banks sometimes ahead of them. I mean, my bottom line is defining stagflation as a combination of recession and inflation. It's likely in much of the world, but in the case of the United States, it's not so clear. We don't have the same adverse supply shocks to the extent that many other countries do.
So you know that there are two things happening at the same time. One, the people are saying that the inflation is coming through the supply chain blockage, and on the same time, what is happening there? The central bank, almost all over the world, including Fed and including the Central Bank of Pakistan, they are raising the interest rate. What do you think? It is contradictory or not?
Well, I mean, there was a year or two ago, there was rapid growth in the US recovering from the recession of the coronavirus in 2020, and driven largely by very easy monetary policy, interest rates at zero in the US and below zero in Europe, and easy fiscal policy, first in the last year of President Trump's term, and then in the first year of President Biden's term, very expansive fiscal policy, which succeeded in bringing the US rapidly out of the recession, and employment growth has been very rapid, and GDP growth, all measures have been up for a while. But really, you don't need any new model to explain why this would result in inflation. The models that we've had for 50 years have said that if unemployment rate gets low, below 4%, which it is now, and output is at or above potential, that you could have inflation from that. It's appropriate that the Fed, with a bit of a delay, perhaps, recognize not perhaps, it did have a bit of a delay, finally recognize the seriousness of the inflation problem, and it's appropriate that they've been aggressively raising interest rates.
Mm-hmm. Let's put it in this way that the countries like Pakistan, mostly the emerging countries and the developing countries, we know that the inflation is coming from the food and energy. Mostly from the food and energy. This is there's a huge component. Actually, the inflation is coming from each and every category, but the food and energy is contributing a lot. Do you think that that the central bank can dampen the inflation when the inflation is coming from food side and energy side?
Yeah, well, there is this demand component, and inflation rates were high in many developing countries even before Russia invaded Ukraine, and even before the food and energy prices went up so much. But clearly, there's a huge component of that for countries that are importers of food and energy, which describes Europe, it describes Turkey, Pakistan, India, Japan. And less so the United States. We're relatively self-sufficient in fossil fuels and grain. We export grain, but that means negative impacts on all the countries I named. And yes, big stagflation, a big adverse supply shock. Now, just because we've run into supply constraints, which we certainly have everywhere, doesn't necessarily mean that it's an adverse supply shock causing it. If you have aggressive expansion in demand, and output is rising for that reason, you're going to run into supply constraints. But that's not to deny the very real effect that rising prices of energy and food have had in so many countries. And the answer to your question is, yes, central banks can still fight inflation even if it arises from food and energy. It's just that adverse shocks, supply shocks of that sort, make the terms of the trade-off worse, make everything harder. So there's always a degree of a trade-off that monetary policymakers face, central bankers face, between, on the one hand, excessive expansion and inflation, and on the other hand, contraction, high unemployment, recession. There's always that trade-off. The terms of the trade-off become worse when you have this kind of adverse supply shock. So you have to suffer a higher level of inflation, at least for a while, for any given level of economic activity. Either that or a lower level of economic activity for any given level of inflation. So it makes things very difficult, and that is a repeat of the situation in the late 70s and early 80s in the US and Europe and much of the rest of the world. So yes, monetary policy can still do something about it, but it's in a much more difficult, it's got a much more difficult problem because the chance of causing a recession or worsening recession is greater when you have all this coming from food and energy.
Now, coming to the currencies, you wrote an article recently, what three economists taught us about the currency arrangement. I just want to know that. Can you please summarize us for what is the implication of that article for our countries, like the countries which has the scarce reserves, international reserves?
Yes, I can try. I mean, the three economists were Robert Mundell, who was a Nobel Prize winner, Richard Cooper, who was a colleague of mine, and John Williamson. They all passed away within a year, and they were great economists. They all three of them happened to be unusually skeptical of floating exchange rates. Exchange rates are determined purely by the market. They were in favor of some degree of government intervention. In the case of Mundell, he was, during most of his career, he was actually in favor of very strong intervention to make exchange rates fixed on moving, or even currency unions. He was really pushing the birth of the euro. In the case of John Williamson, he was also skeptical of floating exchange rates, of unnecessary volatility. He wasn't really in favor of fixed rates. He was in favor of intermediate regimes, somewhere in between fixing the exchange rate and intervening however much necessary to keep it fixed versus free floating, where the central bank doesn't intervene in the foreign exchange market at all. So he studied target zones and crawling pegs and intermediate regimes like that. I've got more sympathy with his approach. I think intermediate exchange rate regimes are the right answer for many countries, including Pakistan. Very small, very open economies are too small to have their own independent currency. And a country as large as, or economy as large as the United States, I think should float, and the Eurozone and Japan. But most countries are somewhere in between. Now that you need foreign exchange reserves in order to intervene, certainly to keep the exchange rate fixed, to defend a peg, but even to dampen the volatility, as in the intermediate regimes, the target zone, or just systematic managed floating, where the central bank buys the domestic currency when it's high and sells it when it's buys it when it's low and sells it when it's high. You got to get that right to dampen the fluctuations. You need foreign exchange reserves to do that, and I understand that Pakistan is currently has quite a low level of foreign exchange reserves as a result of running deficits in the past.
One, the currency of Pakistan is really under pressure, depreciating very rapidly, about 33% depreciation over the last 1 year. This is one thing. Another thing is that when your currency depreciates, it will lead to economic growth through the channel, which you know very well. Do you think that this very rapid depreciation will help, or if we say that the currency is going to be undervalued, do you think that this type of undervaluation or this type of rapid depreciation will help in economic growth in the context of low reserves, low foreign exchange reserves?
Well, with low foreign exchange reserves, you don't have much choice but to allow depreciation, unless you have some massive economic monetary reform programs supported by the IMF. It would have to be. It depends. If you have a relatively stable price level, relatively low inflation, then depreciating the currency in the way that Pakistan has, or another example would be Turkey, where you have substantial depreciation, that should stimulate the demand for exports and improve the trade balance and help growth. But where you've got a high inflation rate, if the depreciation is just equal to or offsetting the inflation rate, then you're just keeping even. My impression is that Pakistan, maybe the depreciation has been so rapid in the last year that it's gotten out ahead of inflation. You would be better positioned to tell me than that. So, if to the extent that the depreciation has happened, not just in nominal terms, but real terms, in other words, to the extent that the depreciation has been in excess of inflation, that should help boost the economy, boost competitiveness. But there's an argument for a long-term nominal anchor to try to fight the inflation and to eliminate it, bring it down rapidly, in which case exchange rate stability is often part of that formula. Let me also say that for countries that are in debt, of which Pakistan is one, if that debt is denominated in dollars or euros in terms of foreign currency, depreciation can have an adverse effect, not just on inflation, but even on the real economy, because banks and firms that borrowed in dollars may be perfectly viable in terms of earning domestic currency and sales. But if your currency depreciates by half against the dollar, then that means your debt service obligations, the interest and the amortization of principal that the banks and the firms that borrowed have to pay doubles if the price of foreign exchange doubles. And that can have adverse effects, cause bankruptcies and reduction in employment. So it's a difficult situation that many developing countries are in.
In the continuation, there's a narrative in Pakistan that Pakistan could default without international help if IMF doesn't help us, or if many other the friendly country do not help us, then we may default. There is a narrative. Do you think, and the people are comparing us with Sri Lanka, do you think the comparison of Pakistan with Sri Lanka is fair? Or if Pakistan, with a population of 225 million, if default, then what would the fallout on the world, on the other economies?
I mean, of course, Pakistan is a very different country than Sri Lanka, much larger, as you point out, for one thing, and different in other ways. But many emerging markets and developing economies are in danger of default. Some of them have already defaulted, Lebanon, Argentina, some others, and many are in danger of it. We've been worried for years that when the time comes that the Federal Reserve and other major central banks are ready to start raising interest rates, and that time has come now, that this would help precipitate some debt troubles among developing economies and including defaults. And especially when the increase in interest rates is associated with an appreciation of the dollar against other currencies, which it has been, then that worsens the problem I was talking about so-called currency mismatch. If domestic banks and firms have borrowed in terms of dollars, but their revenues are in local currency, that worsens that problem. You ask about whether Pakistan's large population would kind of make a default unthinkable, and I'm afraid to say I don't think so. I suppose you're thinking of a too big to fail argument. Is that the idea? But I mean, there are countries with also populations over 200 million and larger economies, Indonesia, Brazil, who have had Nigeria, who have had debt crises, in some cases under pressure now, but I'm particularly thinking of the 80s and the 90s. And their large populations didn't make them too large to fail. I mean, the international community, led by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the G20, does have a historical tradition of trying to help out when countries are prepared to undertake reforms, try to prevent default or to make the best of it in the event it happens. But it's a worrisome situation.
after the fiscal spending of the many governments after the COVID-19 has unleashed a new debate. And when I was talking with Barry Green and Kenneth Galbraith and some other very big names, for example, Kenneth Rogoff, they think that there is a new debate, or there should be a new debate that that the countries, the IMF, or the institution, they should forgive the debt of the developing countries, and the very poor countries or very problematic countries like Pakistan or Sri Lanka or Zambia or other things. Do you think that there should be a debate on this?
Well, the difficulties of the last 2 years, particularly 2020, are a little bit unusual in that it's so clear that there was an adverse shock that was beyond the control of most countries, the COVID-19 pandemic, and that called for a big increase in spending to fight it. In the case of the advanced countries, we not only spend money on public health measures, but also trying to stimulate the economy. In the case of developing countries, they didn't have as much fiscal space, as much room to run up debts, but it is appropriate that they increase spending, most of them in response to the need for public health programs. The basic principles are the same as they've always been, and I think it's worth going through it, since it's easy to lose sight of it. People argue for austerity, and people argue for expansion, and that argument is kind of misguided or confusing, because it depends where you are in the cycle. The countries should run fiscal policies that tighten up, run ideally surpluses, or at least lower deficits, stronger budgets when times are relatively good, like when you're growing, when there's demand for your product on world markets. That's the time to run a strong budget, so that you can create the fiscal space that allows you, if there's some adverse development, some negative shock, allows you to respond to that by increasing spending, whether it's a adverse shift in the terms of trade, like an increase in the price of the products you import, like energy and food, or whether it's a natural disaster, or whether it's like a drought or flood, or whether it's, and of course we're seeing more of that with global warming. And I know that's a problem in Pakistan also. Or if the adverse shock is a deterioration in world conditions, world financial conditions, like increase in interest rates and an increase in risk aversion, any of these, or COVID, any of these adverse shocks call for a response to allow the budget deficit to go higher. But if you've already gone into this period with a high budget deficit, you don't have what we call a fiscal space. Your debt ratio is already so high that there just isn't room for the expansion. And then you're really, really in trouble.
In Pakistan, nowadays, the political instability is there, and the businesses are going to close, they are not working well because of regulations, because of licensing and NCOs and many other things. And I just want to know that what is important for the growth? It is the economic freedom, or political freedom, or the currency undervaluation, or monetary policy, or fiscal policy, or what else?
Well, economists have been studying for years, both in theory and statistically, what helps a country achieve good economic performance. And there's a list of conditions. Certainly, economic freedom is high on the list. Having the state not be too large a share of the economy, and allowing individuals to make their own decisions to the extent possible. the rule of law, property rights, freedom from corruption, openness to trade. These are all important preconditions. They tend to go together with not just economic freedom, but political freedom with democracy, but they don't have to. There are plenty of examples of countries that don't have political freedom, but do have the stability that I mentioned, the other conditions, openness to trade and so on, that have achieved growth. So I regard political freedom as desirable for its own sake, but you can't say that no countries have succeeded in growing rapidly without political freedom, China being an obvious example. You asked about the macroeconomics. Macroeconomic stability, monetary and fiscal stability is on the list of the necessary conditions. And countries with very high inflation rates, I mean, it's sort of a slippery slope. Once you get above 40% inflation, it starts to have negative effect on growth. And then if you go to higher and higher, it can ruin the economy. So for that reason, we have price stability, low inflation, and stable inflation as one of the goals. And having an exchange rate target is a means to achieve that, one possible means to achieve that. Inflation targeting is another possible means to achieve it. Giving independence to the central bank so it can't be so it's protected from political influences is often a useful contribution to growth. So rule of law, property rights, freedom from corruption, openness to trade, macroeconomic stability. I would say those are the conditions that give rise to growth. And it's true, by the way, regardless of whether you're a country that's rich in natural resources or not. Either way, that's the right list of conditions.
There is a discussion in the international finance that the central banks are going to issue their the digital currency, and central banks and some other the institutions. Do you think that the central bank digital currency, they will alter the status of dollars as a reserve currency, or this is just the matter of far away from here about 10 or 15 years? The importance of dollar will be the loss in the market or not? What do you think?
I mean, my short answer is that I don't expect this to, in itself, to undercut the role of the dollar. Let's back up. The new technologies, blockchain technology and all that, are very impressive, and they may have their use. And central bank digital currency may well be in the future for many countries. Well, let me take this occasion to say I don't think that's true, but my guess is that cryptocurrencies and stable coins, when we look back 10 years from now, it'll be a fad that we associate with this period of history, and that people will wonder, why did they ever have so much faith in Bitcoin? And the crash in the value of Bitcoin and many of these other currencies currently might be the marker for the end of this fad. Any case, I don't see much of a use for them for the long term. I mean, Bitcoin is useful for violating the law, but that's not something we approve of. Smuggling and money laundering and so on. Stable coins are like money market mutual funds, except much less secure and less regulated. So I think that I put those aside, and particularly for developing countries. There's some developing countries that have adopted, El Salvador in particular, adopted Bitcoin as a national currency, and I think that was a huge mistake. But you asked about central banks doing it, central bank digital currencies. And there's possibly a role there. I think that transactions costs have been unusually or unreasonably high if a Pakistani immigrant sends money back from the Gulf states or from Europe. You often have to pay a high percentage of the remittance. So you're sending money back to your family, let's say. The transactions costs are higher than they should be. And if the new technology can help reduce those transaction costs, then great. But it's once you're talking about central bank digital currency, it's no longer a question of a radical break from past trends. I mean, after all, most economic transactions, currency transactions, are digital anyway, have been for a long time. And we don't, cash has its purposes, but not for international purposes. And even domestically, most of the transactions, usually when you pay for something, even, it's been true for years, it's paid through the banking system and digitally rather than from cash. And that digital, that method of payment has progressed technologically from the telegraph to computer networks doing it over the internet, to then maybe blockchain technology might be a latest step in that. But that's to my mind, it's a progression that's qualitative and relatively continuous in nature, rather than this revolutionary technological breakthrough or institutional breakthrough that so many people seem to think is happening here.
One more thing, the last thing. And there is a discussion nowadays that the Pakistan should, because the Pakistan nowadays that the foreign exchange reserves in Pakistan is depleting very rapidly, and then we are importing the things, energy and many other things in the dollar terms, and there is a discussion that we should trade with China, or we should alter the currency of the reserves currency from US dollar to Chinese renminbi. Do you think that in the future, in the very near future or the near future, the Chinese renminbi can be a reserve currency as US dollar or not? Should we back with the Chinese currency or not? What do you think? Where is the bigger picture?
Well, two questions. The smaller picture you asked is whether switching to transacting in renminbi in the Chinese currency, the yuan, would help the matters in Pakistan. And I would say no. I mean, the price of oil in terms of Pakistani currency is going to be the same, regardless of whether you transact in dollars or renminbi. The larger question you raised is whether the renminbi will challenge the dollar as a premier international currency. And it has a long way to go. I mean, it has to become a major international currency before it can think of challenging the dollar. The top four international currencies are the dollar number one, the euro number two, and the yen and pound sterling maybe tied for third place. Chinese currency is working its way up to maybe it's a number 5 position. Maybe it's past the Swiss franc and the Australian dollar by various measures of international use. I'm talking about measures like the currency that central banks choose to hold their foreign exchange reserves in, currency they choose to peg to, the currency that international trade is invoiced in, the currency that financial transactions, bank loans and bonds are denominated in, and so on. China is sort of in number 5 position, but now, and maybe it'll climb up number 4, number 3, but it has a long way to go before it challenges the euro, let alone the dollar. And I think the reason is that although China has several of the necessary conditions to be an international currency, it's missing an important one. The conditions it has is being a large economy. you have to have a big home base. I mean, just like English is the international lingua franca, in part, not because of it's attractive or useful or beautiful or efficient in its own right, but in part because so many people, because it has its home territory in the United States and Britain and other English-speaking countries, and then these are important economies, and so that's sort of a necessary condition. And China has that. The Chinese economy now is roughly as large as the U.S. economy or the Euro economy. The second necessary condition is to have stability in the value, to retain its value. If you've got a high inflation rate and a high depreciation rate, nobody's going to want to hold your currency as an international currency. And China pretty much has that as well. There are fluctuations in China's exchange rate, but the same as in the dollar and the euro, roughly. I mean, the dollar and the euro free float more, but the magnitude of the variation is about the same. So what's the condition that China is lacking? It doesn't have deep, liquid, open financial markets the way the US does in New York, or Britain does in London, or to some extent, to a greater extent than China, the euro has. China still has capital controls. It still has a state-dominated financial sector. And it would need to reform these things before I think it could expect to rival the top currencies as international currencies.
Just one thing, as a concluding remark, sorry, as a concluding remark, what should be the advice? Should we go for the inflation targeting, exchange rate targeting, or growth targeting? A country would have the low foreign exchange reserves with the economics, the struggling economy. Any in general remarks?
Yeah, I mean, it's useful to have some anchor, some target for monetary policy. We no longer think that the gold standard is a useful target for anybody. At least most of us think that. And targeting the money supply, some countries still say they do that, but really ever since the 80s, that's been proven to be not so helpful because of fluctuations in the monetary sector. So I've always been a fan of nominal GDP targeting, but nobody's adopted it, and maybe it's too, for better use, lack of a better word, too policy wonky, too academic. So the major contenders are inflation targeting and exchange rate targeting. I think when a country has an inflation rate and a trend depreciation rate as high as Pakistan, either the time is right for a very fundamental reform where you adopt a lot of reforms at once, such as putting the budget and the debt on a sustainable level long term. And then as part of that process, having an exchange rate target can be helpful. But until you're ready for that, and especially without the foreign exchange reserves to achieve an exchange rate target, my answer is I think inflation targeting is the choice that remains.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will have another episode with another guest, Abdul, then. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Professor.
Pleasure. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir.